Hi, my name is Katie, and this is my Mammalogy Final for the oral section. First, I want to talk about the wildlife conflicts that we talked about in our guest lecture. Some of the points that stuck out to me were really intelligence of these animals. I knew that elephants were intelligent, but I didn't really understand the implications of that in terms of management. So she was talking about the Indian elephants and how they were using these traditional methods to kind of keep them away. So electric fences, ditches or trenches, and then of course bees, as we all know. However, the elephants are so intelligent and smart and creative that they've learned to actually grab onto the fence post and pull that down rather than hurting themselves by touching the fence. They'll also do things like hit it with sticks, as she was explaining. Um, in terms of the ditches and trenches, they'll actually dig these out to try to prevent the elephants from crossing, but they'll fill it back in and then cross over. Even with the bees, they're becoming a little bit more resilient to that. And eventually, if they have enough willpower, they will just push through their fear to get where they're trying to go. Another really important fact that I thought she was talking about is the warning signals. Of course, we know with the human interaction with the elephants in conflict, having as much warning and precautions as possible is going to be really beneficial. So, for in terms of the first warning signal, she talked about the text messaging. So they actually get these alerts to their phone so that they know where an elephant is located, especially in the tea plantations, like she was speaking of. But also, I really enjoyed learning about the lights. So she was explaining that a lot of times you will get off of a bus and you actually walk home, and you can see these lights in the distance, and that kind of tells you that these animals are in that location to move away. So, in summary, this is really going to help with reducing the conflict between human and animal and keeping them separate from these massive animals and these elephants. All right, so transitioning, I just want to talk about the family Calorisidae. This is the primate that I chose for my species, and I specifically want to look at the emperor tamarin. I've seen a lot of them. I live near Disney. I go to Animal Kingdom. They have a lot there, so I really enjoy watching and observing them. But their physical features are they are typically smaller. They are some of the smallest primates. They're not the smallest, but they are smaller than some other of the primates that we see. They are arboreal. They have these really unique little whiskers where it's actually where they get their name because they're kind of brushed to the side that looks sort of like a mustache. They do have really these long tails, and they're typically maybe like a red in color. They do not have opposable thumbs. So, like humans, they have kind of these narrow type hands, but they do not have opposable thumbs. Rather than nails, like you would see with some of the other primates, they actually have claws. And then they have these really long, sharp canine teeth. So that would go along with their diet where they eat a lot of bugs, so insects, they eat fruit, gum, and nectar. So their social structure is really interesting, and there's a lot of parts that I would like to mention. But in short, they do have groups that are about 4 to 6 individuals, so somewhat of a smaller group. But what's really interesting is they will actually blend with other species of tamarin. So you may find them with the saddlebacks, and so they have almost this mutualistic relationship where they will bond with others in order for protection. So I think that's really interesting. They also have this cooperative breeding, which is more of like a polygamy type relationship. So you typically have one female that is breeding with multiple males, and then you still have other females, but they are just not reproducing at that time. They do have a fairly short gestation period of 145 to 150 days long, so that's pretty short. And their sexual maturity is actually only 16 to 20 months old, which is pretty young. Adult males will give paternal care, so that is something we talked about in the lecture, and this is one of the species that will do that. And typically, in terms of offspring, they will have two, never more than three, and three is really rare, but they typically have twins. Okay. Their geographical range is in South America and these Amazonian lowland areas. So you can see that on your screen here in that image to your right. So they can cross over into Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia, and they live in all multiple different types of habitats like forest, lowlands, and mountainous forest. And so they have a restricted range, but they do live in various types of habitats. In terms of their conservation, they are typically or they are currently at least concern. So that's probably because they do have this short gestation period. Um, However, they are a little bit concerned that moving forward, because of habitat destruction um, in this area, that they are going to lose their habitat. They are really restricted, so habitat's really important for them. So that is a conservation concern for the future. All right, I am very glad that we touched on this towards the end of our semester. This is something that I'm really interested in, and I did mention this in my species review paper because I talked about the sperm whale, which is highly affected by this, or at least they think so. And so I want to go over kind of what oceanic sound pollution is. So for a really long time, we didn't understand that there was noises happening in the ocean. Humans, we have these ears that are made for above water, but underwater, we just don't know. We just didn't understand until recently. So animals started to die, and we started to actually think about that and look at how that might be affecting it, especially with sperm whales. Think about their clicks and their codas. Sounds really similar to sonar, and it can interfere. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. But many animals all around the globe are affected by this. And so we're going to look at various different species and how that affects them. So this is just a distribution map of the species that we're actually going to look at today. And so what we're going to do is actually take the species that are most highly distributed, and then we'll work our way down. So that's how it's going to be organized. Okay, so with that, odontodids are our most distributed group here, so we're going to start with them, and we're going to look into a little bit about how this is affecting them. So the Arctic industrial development started happening around the 1980s, mining, shipping, all kinds of development, and that's really where this began, and we started to see a lot of this. Some of the effects that's occurring for them is things such as behavioral issues, so that would be like foraging, reproduction. They are having some respiratory changes as well in their behavior, and then the mother and the calf are typically the ones that are most affected by this rather than the adults themselves. The first odontocid that we're going to look at is a personal favorite of mine. That is the beluga whale. So they were most affected by these icebreakers. So you can see that in the bottom of your screen here. And these icebreakers are these large vessels that actually dig in the ice. So you can imagine what that would be like for them. So belugas really were the focus animal for a lot of research on this. And some of the issues that they faced were they do have these big pods, and those were actually being affected. They started having these erratic movements and more rapid, unplanned movements. Their dives started to decrease, so they spent a lot more time on the surface. And then their vocal patterns were actually changing. So this is called the Lombard effect. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But their vocal patterns were actually increasing and kind of adapting to the changes that were occurring in their environment. The narwhal is another large area of focus. This one's really interesting. I think what they found is when the narwhals were actually exposed to a certain amount of hertz, I think it was believed 20 to 1,000 hertz, they would actually just sink. And um, if they didn't sink, they would slow their movement, and or they would just completely stop. And if they were exposed to that 20 to 1,000 hertz, they would sink. So their locomotion was really what was affected by the oceanic sound pollution. Killer whales are being affected by this as well. So we know that killer whales numbers are declining, and so this raises concern for them for sure. And so what we'll see with the killer whale is they have these behavioral changes, of course, with foraging, and then they're coming to the surface quite more often instead of diving down. They do have changes within their respiration. Their swim speed is affected, and they also can be seen with this Lombard effect, and that's typically if they are exposed to um, noise levels between 1 and 40 kilohertz. And another odontid that we will look at that is highly studied is the dolphin. We're going to specifically look at the bottlenose dolphin. They've looked a little bit at other species, but bottlenose is really where all that research is. This image up on your screen, that is somewhere that I was at just this past weekend. I did not participate, but I did walk past their booth and was feeling a little bothered by it. But unfortunately, bottlenose dolphins, they have a lot of human overlap with their activities, and tourists directly will target them to go look at them. So the way that dolphins respond to this are they're going to try to avoid this as much as possible. So they're going to try to change their location. That could create a random travel, so they may not be going to specific places, they may just be traveling randomly. They are going to increase their swim. I mean, it makes sense if you were following them in the boat. They're going to try to get away from that as quickly as possible by moving quickly. This is also going to cause them to travel more. If they're consistently avoiding these vessels, they're going to be moving all throughout. And then, of course, whistle changes. So you see that the noises that they make and the communications that they have are affected by this as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the mycetes. So we're just going to do a quick overview of them. So they're affected actually by smaller vessels, and then if they are close by, then commercial vessels as well. Really, they have a lot of the similarities of the odontocetids, but they do have a lot of avoidance strategies to handling this. So first we'll look at the bowhead, which is on the right side of your screen. So they typically will move away really, really quickly, even at the sound of a small vessel. So they're really looking for those avoidance strategies. So their various behaviors like foraging, play, and reproduction will be altered. And then also with gray whales, you see a similarity there. So actually, they will increase their vocalization. So the Lombard effect. So their low frequency noises will actually overlap with vessels. So that's a problem for them. Of course, the humpback. The humpback is highly studied, and this is within uh, in Alaska currently at Glacier Bay National Park. So they're prone to pollution by tourist vessels. So humpbacks are highly affected by that. But also in Australia, you're seeing that they're facing some of these same challenges, and it's affecting them behaviorally as well. So they have a decrease in breaching, their travel speed is changing, and they don't dive quite as deep. If you know anything about them, they do dive fairly deep, and they're not doing that as much as they typically do. Okay, and then we have the North Atlantic right whale. So what's interesting about them is they had no behavioral response at all. So this really caught scientists' attention. So they started doing fecal samples and they found stress responses, specifically to what they believe is commercial vessels. So um, this caused a shift in their vocalizations. So they had a lower frequency and it started to adapt to their environment. And so they make various noises. One's actually called a gunshot noise or a gunshot vocalization, and that was actually masked by these. So the Lombard effect may be what they are using to adapt to the vessels that are masking their sounds. And we're going to look at pinnipeds. So pinnipeds, as we're moving down, kind of has our less distribution. And so if you look at the italicized, this is out above water. So they did a lot of research in above water studies. So they noticed that they were moving out of their haul out sites. They were becoming more aware of their surroundings, and they would kind of poke their head up to see what the noise was. But when they did underwater, they actually found that mass communication was what was most evident. So really gray seals, harbor seals, and then these northern elephant seals, they really all have the same types of effects. And so basically what you're seeing is they are highly exposed to noise. So between 2.2 to 20.5% exposure. So they really have quite a bit. And so basically their behavior in terms of their diving became really erratic. They would actually come up towards the top of the water and dive down just kind of over and over again, descending and ascending rapidly. And so that's really how they were affected kind of all across the board for all of those species. And last but definitely not least, my favorite Syrian. So we're looking at manatees specifically. So as we know, manatees are prone to these fatal boat injuries, and unfortunately, it happens quite a bit. But what's interesting and scientists thought about is they know that manatees have sensitive hearing, so about from 1 to 30 kilohertz. So why don't they just avoid them? Well, first, they dive down really deep to get the seagrass. And then secondly, they have poor ability to move out of the way quickly. So when they are around boats, they actually will have a change in behavior. They will actually go to lower depths when there's a high boat presence, and they'll also change their swimming speed as well. They'll also try to forage where there's not as much boat activity. So in terms of research needed, kind of just in short, there's a lot of knowledge gaps that are happening, and really we just need long-term broader studies that will look for more response types and really just try to understand what is the cost that is happening for these animals due to this in their biological functions. So you can see that a lot of the more easily accessible species like dolphins and humpback whales are studied more often. Certain areas like Antarctica are really hard to challenge, are really hard to study logistically. So we see a lot less there, even though it's a high area for that. Not all vessel types are looked at. Some species like dolphins are looked at with tourist vessels, but killer whales not so much. So there's a lack there as well. And then responses really they're they're so vast that it's really hard to study them. So we really need to come up with a more broad scale to do that with. And then, of course, vocalizations as well. We need to look not only at the bottlenose dolphin vocalizations, but also within the killer whale vocalizations as well. Right. This is my works cited. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful semester. Thank you.